Well, good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me. If you can't, please do indicate. Great to have so many people with us. Um, this is a bit of a departure for me. This is my first Facebook Live event. And hi, Elizabeth, good to have you with us. So it's a bit of an experiment for me, so I hope you'll be a bit kind as I get used to this format. I think we've all been aware of the huge effect the COVID crisis has had on the country, and there's been a very high-profile victim is probably too strong a word, but near victim in Boris Johnson. And as you probably know, Boris is a noted libertarian. Given the sort of lifestyle he's led, maybe a libertarian is exactly where he'd expect him to be. And he's generally been very resistant to the nanny state, the idea of a sugar tax, and it's all about personal responsibility and enjoy yourself while it lasts. Until I think he was really badly hit by the COVID crisis, and as we know, ended up in the ITU, not quite on a respirator. And in fact, even now, if you see him perform in Parliament and you see how he looks, he certainly doesn't look very well. And apparently, when he went into hospital, he was 17.5 stone, so well into the obese category. And I think Boris is possibly classic in believing that you can outrun a bad diet, because we've all seen him jog for the cameras. But despite all that jogging, he's clearly he's 17.5 stone, and it didn't do a lot of good in the end. And if you compare him, for example, with the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, who admittedly is quite many years younger than Boris, but he kind of shrugged it off and was back at his post in 10 days. So the first question, I guess, is Boris even right to think about the possibility of a sort of a war on obesity? It kind of reminds me of the war on drugs in the Thatcher era. That didn't go down very well. I'd be very interested to know what you think. Please do let me know. Good evening, Sharon. Good to have you with us, and good evening, Martin. Please do let me have some comments in the comment section so that I can respond to your questions and know what you're thinking. The medical orthodoxy, of course, and anyone who follows my Twitter feed will know I rail against this. The medical orthodoxy, of course, is that obesity is a chronic disease. There's nothing that we can do. Once you start on that path, it will only ever get worse, with the need for ever more drugs. And I have to admit, as a health professional, I spent many years believing exactly that. I thought that, it was all about calories in, calories out. Good evening, Debbie, my co-host. I hope that you'll keep me straight. And it was all about calories in, calories out, and exercising, and just a bit of self-control, and eat a little bit less, and move a bit more, and all would all be good. And I spent years avoiding red meat because red meat gives you cancer, and I spent years not eating anything that was fat because fat makes you fat. And when you take out the red meat and you take out all the fat of your diet, what's left? Either you eat nothing, which is pretty difficult, or you end up eating a load of carbs. And we've all health professionals are trained the same way, unfortunately. Pharmacists, doctors, nurses, optometrists, dentists, we're all trained basically to think it's all about calories in, calories out. We've all been trained to think that that eggs are a bad thing because of the effect on cholesterol, and that there's very little that you can do. It's all a long-term problem, and that the only thing that we can do really is treat it with drugs. And as you may know, my group of formerly 10 pharmacies won numerous national awards for service development, and we were very committed to public health and doing new stuff. And despite all the awards that I'd won, I ended up really frustrated because I reached the conclusion we're not really curing anything. So if you stop taking your anti-diabetic tablets, your diabetes comes back. If you stop your antihypertensives, you've still got blood pressure. And so I went back, as you many of you may know, and that's why I call myself the pharmacist that gave up drugs. I went back and I thought, well, what is this epidemic of obesity and diabetes and cancer? Why has it happened only in a generation or two? What is the root cause, and can we do anything about it? Now, I always believed it was a genetic thing, and it was a combination of an obesogenic environment and your genes. But actually, yes, you're quite right, Sharon. The studies do show that obesity is a greater risk for CHD, and that there is a link, and I'll certainly come to that. But I reached the conclusion, actually, that this kind of change of this, what we call non-communicable disease. So let me explain that. In the context of COVID, we're very, very aware of that you can catch an infection from another person, you can catch COVID from somebody else, you can catch flu or a cold. And even in current times, what is killing people in huge numbers isn't COVID, despite the huge concerns we all have about it. What's killing people in huge numbers? Diabetes, cancer, dementia, heart attacks, strokes, all of those cardiovascular diseases. And we call them non-communicable diseases because you can't catch them from one another, unlike the COVID. So what's the root cause? And is there some common link? And why have we seen this huge escalation in all these diseases in a generation or two? Well, if you think about it, if it was a genetic changes can be numbered in hundreds of thousands of years, but we've seen this in a generation or two. I remember as a kid, I was the fat kid in class. I've always struggled with my weight. Now every kid in class is fat, and the exception is the thin kid. What's the root cause? Well, after having researched it for a while, the conclusion I reached was it's essentially lifestyle. Now, we follow the Americans, what they call SAD, or Standard American Diet, and it's a diet high in sugar and carbs and processed foods. And all of those conspire together to continually raise your blood sugar. And raised blood sugar is a bad thing, we know that. And to make it a bit more clear for you, the entire bloodstream of 8 pints of blood at any one time is only designed to have one single spoonful of sugar in. If your bloodstream's got 2 spoons of sugar, you've got type 2 diabetes. So the difference of one sugar lump dissolved in the entire bloodstream is the difference. That's how tightly we control our blood glucose. Every time we spike our blood glucose, because of that toxicity on the body, there's a huge response with a massive spike of insulin. Sugar spike, insulin spike will follow. And most of us spend our days going up and down like a yo-yo with our sugar and our insulin. Now, what the insulin does, it drives the sugar out of the bloodstream into the liver where it's processed to fat. And then that fat is then sent around the body in little submarines, if you like, called lipoproteins, and it fills up your fat cells. And your fat cells eventually become groaning with fat. And it's pretty much like blowing up a balloon. If you keep blowing it up and blowing it up, eventually it'll become resistant. And that is exactly what happens in these cases. We become insulin resistant. And eventually your balloon will go pop. And guess what? That's exactly what happens with our fat cells. And in the end, the fat cells start to go pop, and they let their contents out, and then we've got inflammation. And there are a few links now between the COVID and obesity. But it's not primarily about the obesity. The obesity is what we call the proximate cause, the thing you can see. But the ultimate cause is what I call metabolic syndrome. So the virus has to find a way into the cell. It can't just get into the cell. And you've probably all seen those beautiful red spikes on the end of the virus. Well, those spikes are what allow the virus into the cell, and it enters the cell called by a receptor called the ACE2 receptor. Don't worry too much about that. But this is what, hi Sushil, good to have you with us. The ACE2 receptors are very widely spread throughout the body. You find them in the lungs, you find them in the cardiovascular system, you find them in the guts, and that probably explains why COVID infections have such a wide range of effects, because it all depends which receptors the virus binds to the most. Now, if you have more receptors, then you've got more opportunities for COVID to enter the cell. Okay. Now, good evening, Paul. How are you? The fatter you are, interestingly, and particularly if you're male, and particularly if you're hypertensive, you end up with more ACE receptors. And that means there are more opportunities for the virus to enter the cell. So that's the first problem. The second problem is this: when you have, they call it a cytokine storm, is what's caused by the COVID. When you get it and it becomes really severe. Don't worry too much again about that, but a cytokine storm is when your immune system goes completely out of whack, goes out of control, and eventually can kill you by sort of an extreme immune reaction. Now, the fat cells that I was talking about, they produce a hormone called leptin. And you may have heard of these three different hormones: insulin, leptin, and ghrelin. Insulin is the storage hormone and tends to store energy and conserve energy. Ghrelin is the hungry hormone, and leptin is the satiety hormone. And when those three things work together, everything is well. When you become over fat because you've overstuffed the fat in your fat cells, you get more leptin. And leptin is a cytokine, and cytokine is an inflammatory mediator. So you can kind of see now how a fat person is already more inflamed and is less able to resist the cytokine storm that the COVID produces. So that's the second part. And the third part that we know, that people with high insulin, high fat, diabetes, etc., have a damaged immune system. And what you absolutely need when you've got COVID is the best possible immune system. So you put those three things together and you can kind of see why this isn't going to play out very well. So I'm going to stop there and just answer a few of the questions in the timeline. So Shoran said, yes, obesity is a risk factor. I agree with you, Shoran, but we have to be careful just thinking about obesity, because actually it's a very specific kind of obesity, and there's a concept called overfat. And there are lots of people like me for much of my life who are toffees, fat thin people, if you like. It's where the fat is stored. So if you've got that kind of wobbly fat below the surface of the skin, that's really not a problem. The fat that we're concerned with is the fat surrounding the organs, and particularly the fat around the liver. Because what happens in the end is, when your fat cells get really full, but you're still producing more fat in the liver, the fat backs up into the liver and fills the liver with fat. And that's non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And eventually the liver itself becomes inflamed and ultimately will start to fail. And that is why, although we think of obesity as linked only to fat people, it's not really true. It is more common to have obesity and hypertension, etc., if you're overweight. But there are plenty of people who are not overweight who still have it, and those are the hidden types. And the example I always give of that is Bill Clinton. Now, Bill aced all his Wellman tests until fortunately someone did a calcium score on his arteries, and he had highly calcified arteries and ended up with a quadruple bypass. And Bill Clinton is a typical example of trying to outrun a bad diet. And we see this all the time. Men who've been fit and healthy and always kept slim and been active into their 50s, and then in their mid-50s they get hypertension, or they have a stroke, or they have cancer, and you say, how did that happen to Bill? He was always such a fit guy. And the GP kind of sucks in his teeth and says, it's genetic. Actually, it's not genetic. It's exactly the same cause. It's being overfat. It's a hyperinsulinemia, metabolic syndrome. It's the same problem, but it's hidden because he's thin outside but fat inside. So I think I've answered the one about obesity. Yes, Daxa has said shocking lies. I completely agree. I kind of think of the tobacco industry. And if you follow my my Twitter feed, it was the tobacco industry, remember, used to advertise Marlboro cigarettes, smoke Marlboro brand, because that's the one your GP's most likely to smoke. And there's a famous YouTube that you can still find. This was the chief executives of the 5 biggest tobacco companies, and they swore an affidavit to the Senate committee. There was a Senate hearing, And these 5 chief executives all swore that in their best understanding of the evidence, there was no link between smoking and lung cancer. I'll tell you why it's shocking, because this wasn't in 1934 or 1954, this is in 1994, and you can find it on YouTube. So there we have it. In 1994, the tobacco industry is still claiming there was no link between smoking and cancer, and they've known the truth for 40 years. Exactly the same playbook we find with the processed food industry. They want you, for example, to believe that it's just a question of calories in, calories out, and all calories are the same. And by that implication, 500 calories from a Mars bar or a Pizza Hut or a McDonald's are the same as 500 calories from broccoli. Now think about it, that's clearly not the case. It's how they react on the body. So yes, we have been told shocking lies, Daxa, I completely agree with you. We're told shocking lies by the food industry because it makes its huge amounts of profits from its processed food. And then we as health professionals, how are we trained? We're trained to identify symptoms and treat them with drugs. So you've got this huge paradigm of these 2 massive vested interests on the one hand, big food on the one hand and big pharma on the other. And again, that's why I'm the pharmacist that gave up drugs. Sean asks, is this brown fat or white fat? That's a very good question. You're probably aware that when babies are born, they have a lot of brown fat. And brown fat is much more metabolically active. But as we go through life, we tend to lose the brown fat and there's less and less of it. So the fat that I'm talking about is white fat. That's the one that's the problem. That's the one that releases the leptin, and that's the one that wraps around your liver and causes the insulin resistance, the diabetes, etc. Dilip says lifestyle and the food change are the main factors. Any food either chilled or fresh with a long expiry date is full of preservatives to prolong the shelf life. Absolutely right, Dilip. So one of the other things that I rail about, and I guess I rail quite a lot against the food industry, is these things called vegetable oils. They're called vegetable oils, but they're not vegetable oils at all. They're seed oils. And there's a bit of interesting history here. Back in the days of the cotton industry at its height, when everyone wore a lot of cotton and linen and there were no natural fibres, as a byproduct almost, there were lots of cotton seeds left over. And they found that the cotton seeds were almost a free good, and they found by industrial processing, they could, and very high temperatures and extracting with chlorine and God knows what, they could produce an oil. And the oil was used for lamp lighting. Now, when Edison came along and invented the light bulb, he destroyed the business model. And they thought, well, what can we do? And they thought, well, if we refine the oil a bit more, it could be like a machine oil. And they refined the oil and they found it was fine as a light oil to use for the chain on your bike or for manual sewing machines. But of course, that didn't really solve the problem. And then Procter & Gamble had a brilliant idea. Why don't we refine it a bit further, make it look a bit more attractive and market it as a health food, fresh and dry or crispo. And they took these highly processed oils, marketed them as healthy, said they were low in cholesterol, which of course they are, and ignored the fact that they were completely unfit for human consumption. And I guess that's what we've been doing all this time. It's like if you've got a petrol car and you put some diesel in, it doesn't run very well for very long. And we've been doing the same thing. We've been putting in this diet full of sugar and carbs, processed foods, which are full of seed oils, and all of which conspire together to cause all these problems. Hi, Debbie. Hi, Amit. Hi, Dill. Is there anything we can, Jax asks, is there anything we can take as a preventative that targets the type of inflammation caused by metabolic syndrome? So let me just explain what metabolic syndrome is. It's the result of this diet that raises your insulin, and that raised insulin is the direct cause of the blood pressure, the diabetes in the end, dementia, which some people are now calling type 3 diabetes. And 2 reasons for that. Let's give a brief explanation. Now, dementia is multifactorial and there are many versions of it, so this is only a partial answer. But we know that in type 2 diabetes, your vascular system gets damaged, and you get damage to the back of the eyes, damage to the lungs, blood flow, and obviously that the same problems in blood flow arise at the level of the brain, which reduces oxygenation to the brain and cause damage. What we also know in hyperinsulinemia, raised insulin, is that the brain becomes less and less sensitive to the insulin. And then if the brain ignores the insulin, there are problems of getting energy into the brain cell. So you've got problems of oxygen supply and energy supply to the brain, which may well explain, not the sole cause or the only cause, but may well explain a lot around the link between diabetes and dementia. So can we do anything to prevent this type of inflammation caused by metabolic syndrome? Well, we can reverse the syndrome. So and I can say this in 3 words really: eat real food. In fact, there's a group of us who think we should change the strap line, and it should say something like, protect the NHS, save lives, eat real food. By eating the normal diet, the kind of diet that our ancestors ate, or the diet, if you think about it, I've been watching quite a few of these World War I movies and documentaries. No one was overweight 2 generations ago because they weren't eating this processed food. So actually the answer is relatively simple, Jax. If we move away from this diet of highly processed food, full of carbs, full of sugar, full of seed oils, we get rid of that inflammatory milieu in the body, and you can reverse metabolic syndrome very rapidly. I mean, I normally see results within, well, we start to see huge drops within 2 weeks. And certainly during the 8 weeks of the ProLongevity course, people are substantially reversing their metabolic syndrome. Dilip says visceral fat around the belly and the organs. Yes, it is the visceral fat around the belly and the organs. That's true. But most specifically of all, it's the fat within the liver that's the most important. And it's that liver that really is the cause. And that explains why you can be thin on the outside and fat on the inside. Hi, Lucy. If you feel that you've missed out, we will be replaying the video. So anything that you've missed up to now, we will have an as-live version of it on our website, and you can catch up. But do feel to ask any questions that you'd like. Dilip says there's a lot of collusion to keep a lid on lung cancer via smoking, and it's purely to protect the industry's profits. Absolutely right, Dilip. And that's still going on. Obviously, the cigarette industry is struggling now to sell its evil wares in industrialized societies, but we know it's trying to recruit children in poor societies. And you know, it's the same, isn't it? When the American soldiers came back from war, or they gave the free cigarettes to the soldiers, there's a fantastic parallel here. Actually, this is again one of my rants. Did anyone see that thing where Krispy Kreme donuts delivered 2,000 free donuts to an NHS hospital trusts to reward the hospital staff as they came off the COVID ward? Fantastic marketing opportunity for Krispy Kreme. And I put it like this: if Marlboro cigarettes had delivered 2,000 packs of cigarettes to the same hospital for the same health professionals as they came off the ward to reduce their stress, would that have been seen as a good thing? Because there's very little in it, and it's exactly the same time of marketing. Give it some thought. So Dax has said, follow the money. I completely agree. Neil, hi Neil. Neil is my next door neighbour and our local dentist. I highly recommend him. Breakfast cereals killing kids, all with healthy images. Absolutely right, Neil, and guilty as charged. Cheerios. Looks really healthy on the front, says a source of this and a source of that. And one of the things I always do with my clients is I explain to them how to read the back of the pack. I would say to everyone, ignore the front of the pack, look at the back of the pack. And if it says it's low sugar and a source of protein and it's got loads and loads of ingredients on the back, you can pretty much guarantee it's unhealthy. Not only breakfast cereals, Neil, but an awful lot of baby milk is also full of sugar. And it's interesting, there is sugar in breast milk, but relatively low amounts, and it's a different type of sugar. So the average, I know Cheerios, I think I worked it out, 80% sugar, 80%, unbelievable amounts. Sarah says, what do you think about mono and diglycerides, the fatty acids in breads? I think what you're, well, I think it's like this, Sarah. If you buy the supermarket bread, it's not that much fat in it, but there's sugar in it. And the reason that there's sugar in the bread isn't actually to make the bread taste nice. It's actually a humectant. That means it maintains moisture. And you know, if you buy the bread from the bread shop, it's gone stale within a day or two. Whereas the bread from the supermarket lasts a week out of the fridge, and that's because it's full of sugar, and the sugar there keeps it moist. So I'd be more concerned about that. But I think the key point here now is, unless you bake your own bread or you buy it from a baker who does things properly, bread now is highly processed food. It's the opposite of healthy. Dilip says, too many preservatives, salt and sugar levels are high, and porridge is way better. Well, okay. That's not really the case, Dilip. The too many preservatives, I agree with that. Salt is another of these misnomers that we've been taught. You know, the fat makes you fat, that was rubbish. Avoid the sunlight, that was rubbish. We need the vitamin D. Salt and hypertension. So we all believe this, myself included. The studies around hypertension and salt are really poor quality studies, only done in hypertensive people for very short periods of time. The truth is, actually, we need quite a lot of salt. It's a really healthy thing. And again, I spent years not only avoiding the red meat, etc., putting no salt on anything. And I've actually had to go back to drinking full cream milk, which I avoided for years, and having salt on my food, because salt is actually really healthy and we need it. The link between salt and hypertension is a false link, just like the link between eggs and cholesterol is a load of rubbish, and the link between red meat and cancer is a load of rubbish. So you said porridge is way better. Well, not really, and I'll explain why. Yes, it's true that porridge is a more complex carb, unless it's true that it's got low levels of actual added sugar. But here's the thing about complex carbs. Carbs, or starches as we otherwise know them, are basically glucose molecules glued together with an oxygen. When you metabolize your carbs, guess what? They turn to sugar. So that is why I always say to people, look on the back of the pack. If it says low sugar, it means nothing. How much carbs are in there? So if your porridge is 80% carb, even though it may only have a tiny amount of sugar, in effect it's 80% sugar. And I've got so many of my clients who've had a, quote, healthy breakfast of porridge, and it gives them a huge sugar spike, and an hour or two later they're slumped in their chair like that. Me too. You also got to think about micronutrient content. So we all obsess about the macronutrients, the carbs, the proteins, and the fats. Well, the carbs are full of energy that we probably don't need, but in nutritional terms, almost nothing at all. So your morning porridge gives you energy you don't need and almost no nutrients. Much better actually to have nothing at all. And many of my clients are quite happy skipping breakfast. I do. But if you are going to have a breakfast, there's nothing better than going to work on an egg. Eggs got no carbs in at all. And despite the bad reputation they've been given, it's about the most nutritionally complete food you can have. There are so many different ways to cook it. It's really healthy. Daxa says, so much respect for you for giving up the drugs and actually caring about people. Well, I tell you what, we health professionals, doctors, nurses, pharmacists, we go into healthcare to do our best for patients. And most of us are really frustrated that we end up treating people and they never really get better with just suppressing symptoms. It's all about training. I guarantee you that if health professionals were trained properly, we would behave differently. I gave a talk to a GP surgery recently, and there were 2 or 3 newly qualified doctors, and I asked them, how much training did you get in sleep, nutrition, exercise? And they told me nothing on sleep, nothing on exercise, 1 single day on nutrition, and that was a new course. So that year they'd done a day's worth on nutrition. Any doctor who'd been qualified the year before or the year before that knew nothing at all. So we are trained to identify symptoms and treat them with drugs, and that is a paradigm that needs to change. Dilip says even the cereal protein bars are full of colorants, preservatives, and chemicals. Absolutely right. Do contact me afterwards with some emails, but if there's anything that you'd like to talk about. But healthy cereal bars, most of them are the opposite of healthy. They're full of carbs. They say high protein, but there's not much protein. It's poor quality protein. Almost all of them have got seed oils as well. So don't be fooled by the health food industry. Often health foods are really unhealthy foods disguised as being healthy. It's all a cynical ploy. Martin is asking about the caveman diet. Well, I go some way down the track with that. It kind of depends where you get what that means. I mean, there's a single. I don't think there's one single definition. But if you think back to our hunter-gatherer forebears, what would they have been doing? They'd have been moving steadily most of the day to collect something, and they'd have run like hell every so often, either to kill something or avoid being killed. They'd have lived on nuts and berries, but they weren't farmers, remember, that's a relatively new thing. And every so often they'd have killed an animal and gorged themselves on the animal and eaten nothing else. So your average caveman, and let's face it, we are basically cavemen living in a space age, would have been, what's the likelihood they'd have been eating 4 balanced meals a day of a mixture of Doritos and Pizza Hut and Diet Coke? Absolutely not. One of the points here is, which I'll maybe talk about another time because I think we should come to an end, is it's not just about what you eat and how you eat, it's when you eat. And your average caveman would have had feast and famine. And part of the problem for us is that we only ever have feast and more feast and more feast. Sharon asks which oils we should be ingesting. Think of the sorts of oils your grandparents and your great-grandparents ate. Avocado oil, the Greeks and the Spanish in particular have tons of olive oil, and in all these studies where they used to say that saturated fat was, this is another lie we've all been told about saturated fat, that it's always been known that the French eat lots of saturated fat, loads of cheese, and yet they got very low levels of cardiovascular disease, and it was always called the French paradox. And the explanation we're given, they drink more wine, and that's what it is. The truth is, it's all rubbish. So avoid the seed oils. Do not worry about the fat, but anything animal fat, natural fat, ghee, which a lot of the Asian community have become really frightened of. And I always say ghee is what we're designed to eat. Butter, coconut oil is a big favorite of mine, particularly if you're going to heat things very hot. And olive oil, you can't get too much of it. Jackson says, I love ghee and avocado oil, extra virgin oil, cold pressed coconut oil. I would have butter too, but I can't tolerate dairy. So absolutely, there's the explanation. Hi Karen, how are you this evening? Colin says, is it possible to permanently reverse type 2 diabetes? Well, that's an interesting question, and I don't have time to deal with that in detail. The short answer is yes, but you can only do it if you make permanent changes to your diet. If you've got type 2, then you will never really be able to tolerate sugar and carbs. So you'll always have to avoid them and be quite stringent. So long as you make that radical and permanent change to your lifestyle, then absolutely yes. Daxa says, how horrendous were the boxes of food sent to the vulnerable? Absolutely. You know, these free food boxes that were distributed by the government to the shielding people. Just think about it. We've got the most vulnerable people in society who probably already had all sorts of long-term conditions, and then we gave them a load of free food to make things worse. Dilip says, if we can have the impetus to type 2 diabetes, we can reverse it. Absolutely, and that's exactly what ProLongevity does. Elizabeth says that she put, by eating a real food, low carb lifestyle, she put her diabetes into remission 3 years ago, and she's now got a perfect HbA1c. Lucy says they don't even teach them about food or to cook anymore. I completely agree with you, Lucy. I think we have forgotten what food is. We've forgotten what cooking is. Our kids now think food is something that comes from a packet in the supermarket, and we've completely lost contact with it. I'm a big fan of Jamie Oliver, and he's done a lot around that. So yes. Daxa says, what's the deal with salt? I think I answered that earlier on, Daxa. Don't worry about it. For most people, salt's absolutely fine. Daxa says, is there such a thing as too much protein? There may be. Protein too, for some people, can give you a sugar spike. What appears to be the case is that as you age, you need a bit more protein. And I generally recommend somewhere between 0.8 grams per kilogram weight and 1.2. But we need to get into the specifics of that because that's quite an individual answer. Elizabeth says, refined or not, your body can't tell the difference between white sugar, honey, both glucose. Both result in an insulin spike. That's true, Elizabeth, but one thing I would say, not all sugars are the same. Glucose can be metabolized by every single cell in the body. Fructose, the fruit sugar, can only be metabolized by the liver. So fructose is do not pass go, do not collect 200 pounds, go straight to fatty liver disease. It also bypasses all the satiety mechanisms. And that's why another of my big rants are against the so-called innocent smoothies, full of fructose. Daxa says that continual glucose monitors are fab to see exactly how foods are affecting your blood glucose. Absolutely right, Daxa, and that's what we do. Why do health professionals generally ignore patients when they tell them about their health successes using real food? I think because we're a little bit arrogant. We've been trained in a particular way, and there's a thing called cognitive dissonance. When you've been trained, as I had, to practice in a particular way, and you've practiced your profession to the absolute best of your ability for 30 years and won all these prizes, and someone comes in and does absolutely everything wrong and gets a good result, you can't really cope with it, and you tend to dismiss them. And that is something that we all health professionals are guilty with. And actually, interestingly, if you listen to either David Unwin or Asim Malhotra, who are both huge heroes of mine, they will both tell you that they were converted on their journey by patients who brought them up short and made them confront their own cognitive dissonance. Paul says, if one cuts out potatoes, rice and all bread completely, is that advisable permanently? The answer to that, Paul, is very individual, and that's where the CGM comes in. If all those cause you huge problems, and you've got very out of control type 2 diabetes and you're really susceptible, that may well be the case. Certainly in type 1 diabetes, where there's no insulin, that's pretty much inevitable. Most of my clients, actually, we can find forms of the rice or forms of the bread or forms of the potatoes, ways of consuming it that don't spike them. So what we do is we try and focus on which ones really matter to you and what versions can we find that won't upset you. Elizabeth says, eat real food, meat, fish, eggs, cheese, nuts, green veg, and a few red berries. Absolutely right. And Dilip says that Sardinian and Sicilian people have one of the best longevity. And one of my favorite TED Talks is one on blue zones. So if you just Google blue zones TED Talks, it's only 12 minutes and it might be the best 12 minutes you ever spend on your life. Omar says, Graham, you're looking well. Thank you, Omar. I'm just past my 60th birthday last year, and on any medication. I'm quite proud of that. Empowering people for change. Yeah, that's what we tried to do. Okay, we said we'd run for half an hour. We've actually run for 40 minutes. This is very much an experiment. We will record it and put it on our website so anyone can view it later. It's been great to have so many people be involved with this. I hope it's been helpful. Do please send them in any comments and any changes and anything you'd like us to do differently. And if you think it's been worthwhile, I promise you we'll do another one. So thank you all very much. Good evening, and eat real food, save lives, and protect the NHS. Bye now.